I believe that I am rubbing shoulders with some of the most practical, innovative, creative people in the vermiculture community today. And when I say that, I'm not talking about, Troy and Heath and the other guy and Laura and Samantha, because they all had a beginning somewhere. When Troy was, messing with his first pile of compost, he wasn't looking 10 years or 15 years ahead, realizing where he will be in 10 or 15 years, because we don't think like that. But as I look at you, I realize, I see the vermiculture movement as a real movement. I mean, I see it as something bigger than I think we are really imagining. I've watched some movements. I was a hippie. All right, I got it over with. But I was a hippie when I was a young kid, And the hippie movement, started when the Beatles got off the airplane. The hippie movement began in the United States. And no one thought it would go anywhere, but I want to tell you, that movement, for better or for worse, that movement has transformed our nation. And what we are doing, because the movement that we're involved in, there's so much substance to what we're doing. You may say, I didn't know there was a lot of substance in my worms. But I'm not talking about there's substance in who we are and what we're doing and where we're heading is such a big, big, big deal. So if you're here today and you just started your first worm bin, don't look at yourself as, well, I just started my first worm bin. Samantha's been doing it for this many years. It has nothing to do with it. It has to do with who you are and the direction you're going to go and what you're going to do with the information that is imparted to you at meetings like this and other tools for communication. As the early pioneers of our country proved to a watchful young nation, their dreams and hopes were not in vain. So you, the pioneers of this grassroots movement, are an integral part of rescuing us from a crumbling synthetic fertilizer system that is literally leading our nation over a cliff.
That's right.
And if you study a little bit about it, and you get a little more informed as we go along, you'll come to realize that statement is not far-fetched. Troy was talking about, what happens to the soils, when we stop treating the earth as we should be treating it, and eventually they blow away and there's nothing left. And we know and have heard from some of the great people with prophetic minds that if we keep going, if the agricultural business keeps going in the direction it's going, we are going to have a real problem in our nation. And here's the thing, in this room, we, plus many other people, I'm not trying to limit it to this group, but we are the solution to that problem. And we're faced with it, and we're hands-on with it. I mean, it's a reality. And my hat is off to all of you. Make no mistake, a great frontier lies before us. I'm getting old. I'm not going to see it more than likely. I shouldn't say I'm getting old. I'm getting older. And whether you are just beginning your first worm bin or managing a successful worm farm business, your worth to the survival of agriculture in your community, in our nation, and in the world has not yet even been recognized. But the world's waking up, and they're waking up rapidly. When I took my first bag of worm castings for sale 4 years ago, I had to explain to everybody what was in the bag. And then I had to help them understand it doesn't smell, it's okay. You can touch it, it won't kill you. And today it's a whole different story. Today the story is this. Anywhere I go, people say, oh yeah, tell me more about that. I've been reading about that. I've heard about that. My cousin grows some. So I'm at the farmer's market, and I wish Zach was here to hear this. And the reason I'm called Captain Matt is I have a tour boat company on the Hudson River up in New York. in the summers. In the winters, it's a little cold up there. So I have a customer that, at least twice a year they call me and say, hey, my cousin's in town, and we have friends in town, can we go out for a tour? And I take them out for a tour. And Jill and Marshall, just wonderful people. They're both geologists. I was at the farmer's market, and Jill and Marshall come by, and they look at me, and they're like, what are you doing here? Because they had known me as Captain out on the river. And I said, well, I have a worm farm, and I make organic fertilizer, and I'm selling it. And Jill says, you know what? My cousin does that too. And so she goes on to tell me, oh yeah, and he's got this big farm out in Arizona. And so, what's his name? She says, Zach. And I said, oh, I know Zach. I mean, that's how the world is changing so fast. And I didn't know Zach. I know him from videos. I've never met Zach. I was hoping to meet him today, but that's just not going to work. But the self-destructive direction that the synthetic fertilizer industry has led us in is slowly and methodically being replaced. And it's being replaced by innovative farming practices and the ever-expanding vermiculture movement. I talked to some guys in our town that do, they're in the same business Laura's in, and every now and then they get so frustrated. They say, the town's never going to catch on. They'll never grab a hold of what we're doing. We're doing something that's so important. We're not the answer. My worms aren't the answer. Your worms aren't the answer. Troy's tea isn't the answer. But it's a combination of it all put together. What Troy taught us this morning, and the different things, like I forgot John out there with that funny cone thing. Do you see it? This silver thing out there? What do you call those things?
Tea extractor.
The tea extractor, thank you. I want to tell you something. That thing is just a tiny little tea extractor compared to the tea extractors that we're going to see 10 years from now, that because that's going to be the fertilizer in the future, because what they're using today is doing nothing but killing us, giving us cancer, killing our soils, and giving us inferior foods. And it's all going to change, and when it changes, it has to turn to the vermiculture industry and to really looking at the microbiology of soils and where that's going to go. Just mark it down. No matter what direction that goes in, worm farmers are going to be right in the center of it all. And not only will they be, they always will be. Because you can't produce enough tomorrow for next year. Everything's got to be fresh, and year after year. And some of you will live long enough to see the day when people are calling you saying, oh, shucks, if I called you last week, I could have gotten a truckload. You say, me, a truckload? Yeah, you a truckload. Some of you sitting here one day may be producing that much. You will be educating people, because as you learn, you can't hold this inside. We've got such true principles that you can't hold it inside. You've got to share it. So the work of the local worm farmer, making available speaking engagements, selling of worms, selling of worm casting, going to nurseries and selling there, going to the farm market, the farmers markets, and sharing our worms and our worm castings with our friends and our neighbors. Listen, this is grassroots. What's happening in vermiculture today, if it was legislated by the United States Congress, would not have got as far as we've gotten in the past 20 years.
That's right.
It's grassroots. This is what's going to make the difference. And it's the no-till approach to farming. Now, you may not know a lot about it, and I don't know a lot about it, but I know enough about it. And listening to the bacteria and the fungi from Troy just made it a little clearer to me again today about the importance of it. But this movement, this no-till movement, I'm a gardener. I've been a gardener since I was 19, so I always turn my soil over. It's just the way I've always done it. But the no-till approach that is producing the product that Troy spoke about this morning, It's not happening rapid. It's not happening so fast that, it's showing up on CBS News every time you turn the TV on. But I want you to know something. It's moving. It's happening. I watched the movie Kiss the Earth. Some of you might have seen it. But the farmer that shares the no-till approach, he's looking at us and saying, look, he said, once I got this thing established, getting rid of all the commercial insecticides and fumigators and artificial fertilizers and all that junk, he said, once I got rid of that, he said, I started making money in the farming industry. He said, before that, I used to give all the money to the chemical fertilizer people. But he said, that's not the case anymore. And there is machinery right now for no-till farmers that as they go along and they pop a piece of corn in the earth, they have fingers all around that popper that puts the corn in the earth, and it's putting worm castings all around that one piece of corn. And so as that corn starts to germinate, that's what it does, and it starts to germinate, it's already being fed by our worm castings. Now I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but I started my first vermiculture business when I was 4 years old. I can see your looks. I don't know if you think I'm crazy. My best friends lived next door. I was one of 9 kids. Frank was one of 4. My mom, she didn't have a lot of spare time with 9 kids. I was number 7. And so I'd always go over to Frank's house, and Frank's grandmother lived with them. And so Grandma took care of the kids, and Mom played tennis, but she also had a garden. And one day I went over, I was 4 years of age when I went over, I looked over and I said, hey, Mrs. Rawls, I said, what you doing? And she loved me. And I'll tell you a secret. I think I was in love with the lady, to be quite honest. So I looked at her, I said, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm pulling the weeds out of my rock garden. And I said, can I help? And she said, sure, come on, Maddie. And so she said, now look, and this is at 4 years old, I still remember it. She said, don't break the weeds off, pull them out by the roots. So she said, pull them out by the roots, because if you just break them off, they're going to come right back. And so I said, okay. And so we went ahead, and over a few days, we pulled all the weeds in her beautiful rock garden. Then she started spreading this black stuff all in between the rocks and where she was going to put her plants. And she got halfway through, and she said, oh, shucks. She said, I thought I had enough for my garden, and I don't. I said, well, what is that? And she says, well, we take our leaves and put them over in the corner there, and they rot down over the winter, and then they turn into compost. And I was putting compost all over. I said, Ms. Ross, we've been putting our leaves behind our garage for 30 years. Now, I was only 4, but I knew that. So we had, for 30 years, leaves just went behind the garage. And I said, we got lots of that black stuff back there. That's where I got my worms when we went fishing. I never caught a fish, but the puddles were only this big. But so she said, Matt, do you think it's okay if you could get some? I said, I know it's okay. We can do anything we want with that pile of dirt in the back behind the garage. And so she said, fine. I said, I'll go get you some. And so I grabbed anyone remember the radio flyer wagon? Oh, yeah, look at that. The older people understand, we all had a radio flyer wagon. It was a red wagon, 4 wheels. You pull it. Your best friends get in, you make 5 cents if you pull them around the block, or your big brothers beat you up if you don't pull them around the block for free, or whatever it was. So I went over and I took the flexible flyer wagon and I filled that wagon up, and I brought the wagon over to Ms. Ross, and we spread it all around. And she said, do you think there's any more? Because I'm almost done. I said, oh, there's a whole bunch, Ms. Ross. And so I went back and I filled it up and brought the wagon over again, and we finished the garden, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and I saw her hands go into her purse. And my eyes were like, woo! You're one of 9. You don't see hands go into purses in front of you. So I heard cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. I was like, whoa, Mrs. Ross paid me for selling worm compost. And that was a long, long time ago. But what happened to me, if you spoke to me 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and talked to me about worms, I'd look at you and say, oh yeah, really, that's great. Oh yeah, good. I gotta go now. It didn't interest me. But then, I was gardening, and as I read, I learned organic gardening was better than chemical gardening, so I became an organic gardener. And then I started reading, I read about this worm thing, and but I read an article that was it was really well done. And so I went ahead and bought some worms, and you know how it goes. You get a few worms, it's like that's why we had 9 kids. Any Irish Catholics here? You just reproduce all the time. And so our worms reproduce, and they just keep reproducing. By the time COVID hit, and this is the early stages of COVID, my worm bin had really gone bonkers. I divided them so many times I can't even remember. But at the time, I was the director of operations for a 300-bed homeless shelter and drug rehab center. I love my work. I really loved it. Some of the people from that work, but some of them are still my very best friends, and I see them all the time. Guys that, lived under a bridge for, a few years and then came to our shelter and got some help and then got back into society. By January 2020, the word COVID was like every other word out of our mouth. My wife and I had taken a trip down to Florida. We got in an airplane and flew down to Florida. And then on the way back, we got in an airplane again and we flew over to Mississippi. My son is in the service and has been. At that point, he was in the service for about 12 years. We went over to visit him. And so we get this phone call from Luke. And Luke said, "Hey, Dad, this COVID thing's really getting out of hand. And they just closed airlines going to China, and they're talking about stopping airlines going to Europe." And he said, "This is a real serious thing." And he said, "Dad, I don't think you should get on that airplane." I said, I was on 2 airplanes in the past 3 weeks, and now you don't want me to get on an airplane, and I'm in Mississippi. And he said, "We're coming down to get you." And so my son, who lived in Mississippi, he took us to Virginia, and Luke and his brother Peter came down and met us in Virginia and drove us back home. So it really got to be on the way we were talking about where I'm working. I was 68 years of age. I know I don't even look that today, but I was 68 years of age back then. I had a major decision to make, and that was, am I going to go to the homeless shelter? And I'm one of them old people that if they get COVID, they die, And I'm like, well, should I do it? And the kids are looking at me and saying, no, you're not going to do it. And we had a family talk about it. And I'm going to get to worms in a minute after I tell you about my family. We made a decision, and I'd go for early retirement. And we did. I retired 3 years earlier than I had planned. At that point, my herd of worms was really, really big. And I had so many castings, I didn't know what to do with them. I was using them in my garden. I was giving 5-gallon cans to neighbors and friends. My brothers and sisters were gardeners, and we were just giving them all over the place. And so I had a decision now. I'm retiring. I'm not going to go back to work, and I've got to do something. And I decided after reading and listening to you, and because of you, the movement is where it is at, and because of you and the movement where it is at, I got going on the movement, and I said, I think I can do this. And so at that point, I made a decision to ramp it up. I started out with 10 50-gallon barrels laterally cut. But I went from the barrels, I went to 5 CFTs, 30 inches by 8 foot, and then we had 2 other smaller ones that made 5. And then at a certain point, when I was starting to sell, I couldn't get enough castings out of my CFT because my customers were like, I told them, yeah, I'll bring you X number, and I couldn't. The CFT just doesn't produce. It's great for you and great for me, but if you have you have a big demand on you, a CFT isn't going to work. So decided, forget the CFT. I got on top of the CFT with a shovel, and I emptied the entire thing out. I strained it, bagged it, and then we went to market. But then I went from there. We went to 1-ton bags. Some of you might have seen our video about with these big old 1-ton bags. And so we had 10 to 15,000 worms in every one of the 1-ton bags, and every other day or so, I would dump 5 gallons of compost in, a lot of food, and the worms would go through, and they'd eat it, and they'd leave their poo behind, and slowly, over a 7-month period, that bag filled up right to the top. And what was it? It was just worm castings. It was really, really exciting. And then I got to a point where, and I'm saying this because some of you may get to this point, and that because of my age, I could no longer comfortably lift these 5-gallon buckets filled with compost over. I had to raise it about this high and dump it into those bags because I had arms on the bags holding the bags up in an upright position. And so this year we picked something up from Zach, but he has what's called the wedge system. And so I developed the wedge system, but I don't have the space that Zach had, and so I built a wedge system in a 4x8 bin on top of concrete floors, and today that's how we operate. And last year we made, I shouldn't say we, the worms and I made 8 tons of worm castings. Now that's not a lot of castings when you look at the reality of what's going on in the world today. For me, it was like, whoa, 8 tons. And I just sold the last bucket the other day. Someone said, yep, we're getting one of her flower gardens, they're pulling everything up and replanting. They wanted to get a bunch of castings in, and I sold everything out of that 8 tons. And then, so this year we have a goal, and the goal is we're shooting for 10 tons. But the question arose, and that is this, is what am I going to do with the worm castings? How am I going to sell my product? And I had made a decision. I might change somewhere along the line, but I've made the decision I'm not selling online. I'm a people person. I like people, and for me to sit behind a computer and package a box all day, it's like that doesn't interest me. I want to get out where people are and talk to people. And so I decided we're not going online. And I wasn't looking to get rich. I mean, my time to get rich was a long time ago, and I missed that 100%. You know? So I wasn't going to try at the age I am now. I decided all I really need out of my little business is I want to be compensated for my time, and all the money that I expended, I want to get that back. And my wife's my bookkeeper. She gave me those 2 points. You know, she wants some money back. And so we live in upstate New York, in the Capital District, around Albany. And up there, we have about 1.5 million people within a 10-mile radius around Albany, New York. And I realized and all around in the 10-mile radius, you know, town after town after town after town, not big towns, little towns, Troy, New York, and Mechanicville, and different towns. But the interesting thing is, most every town had a nursery. I realized we got a market. The market's there. The next thing to do is I had to figure out how I'm going to sell. And again, we've been in the business of worm castings now we're going into our 4th season. Along the way, if you followed us on YouTube at all, you understand that it's not that we're not happy with where we are, but this is an ever-changing industry. And what we tried last year may not do it for this coming year, so we had to make some changes. And we've made a lot of changes. As a matter of fact, if you're like, gee, Captain Nat, he's got all the answers, when you watch my earlier videos, you probably got frustrated because I'm changing. I change, and we change every time. And today, what we've done is we've developed a product line. We have 1-gallon boxes filled with worm castings. We have quart-sized bags with a little window in it filled with castings. We offer quart-sized worm casting tea at the farmer's market. We have 5-gallon buckets that we sell. I have an ecosystem. This is the coolest thing in the world, and it happened by accident. And that is, everyone knows what the trays are, where we put the trays. We've spoken about them today. And when I breed with 500 worms in a tray. And last year I got so ahead of myself. Mimi, I know that never happened with you, but I got so ahead of myself. There was so much work that I had these breeder bins that they weren't breeder bins. They were the sin of neglect on my part. You know? I couldn't get to them all, but I found something. I was like, whoa! Even at that, I looked in the bins and was like, you know, our bins. We have a system where we calculate that we pull up about 1,000 to 1,500 cocoons out of 500 worms over 3 weeks. The cocoons, we got so busy. You're supposed to separate the worms from the cocoons before the cocoons hatch, and then, you know, break it up and put it in other bins and let those little babies grow up and grow up in a civil sort of way. And so I looked in the bin, and all the babies already hatched. And they're really small, and I was like, oh, Matt, you are such a loser. And because you're laughing, but I had 18 of them that I had abused. And they were all hatching. Someone called me for some worms. Go to the farmer's market, and but if you want me to bring something special, you have to call me ahead of time. Go to my website, and you call me ahead of time, and I'll bring it to the market. And so someone called me and said, hey, I want a pound of worms. And I thought to myself, I was like, a pound of worms. Now I'm going to have to take time and separate them worms, and then weigh the worms. And then you ever hear of anyone doing that? You know, and I said, in those bins, there's not only worms, it's 500 adults, there's a whole bunch of babies, there's still a lot of cocoons because they're still breeding and laying cocoons, and the microorganisms in the bin were, I mean, these bins were alive. I thought, instead of a pound of worms, how about if I give you a 5-gallon can of worms with babies and with cocoons and with a lot of microorganisms? I said, it'd be the greatest thing for you. And so I kind of talked the person into it because I didn't know what else to do with my worms. But you know, I didn't sell 1 pound of worms last year by themselves. I sold nothing but ecosystems. And I continued the process so that everyone, the babies are together with the main worms, and then I put them in a 5-gallon bucket. All right, so we got our product line. I had a big problem. I had no sales experience at all. And that's a problem, you know? And not only did I have no sales experience, the thought of me going and knocking on the door of a nursery and asking them if they would like to buy some of my worms, some of my worm castings, the thought of me doing that made me nauseous. I was like, I was sick to my stomach. I didn't want to go selling. Well, my wife was looking at me saying, when are you going out to sell everything we invested in, Matt? I was like, well, it's coming up, honey. Honestly, I would have chose a root canal without any Novocaine that day, you know, instead of knocking on that door. And to make things worse, I picked Hewitt's nursery to go to. Now, Hewitt's has 7 nurseries. And they're not fancy. We have fancy nurseries in our area where, a little pot this big is, $75 with a little flower in it, and there's a crowd that loves to buy that stuff. But Hewitt's isn't that. Hewitt's is down-to-earth type of stuff. There's dirt all over their floors when you walk in. It seemed like a really good place to go. And so I went to the one of the stores that was closest to me, and I asked them who their buyer was. And they said, yeah, Ethan's our buyer. And I said, can you give me his number? Sure, we'll give him. So I called Ethan, made an appointment to go and see Ethan. I brought my product with me. You always bring your product with you. And so I have my bag of castings. I show him the product, and he's like, yeah, man, we've heard about this worm casting stuff. And it's really interesting. But he said, we do all our buying in July and in August. Well, this was early spring. I'm out trying to make my sale. And he said, listen, come on back next year and let's talk about it. And I want to tell you something. I was so discouraged. I was like, I knew it, man. I knew it. That my stomach was getting ripped apart. But I said, all right. And I looked at my list. I made a list of all the nurseries, and I figured out my route. And I looked and found my next nursery. I was going to go to Gay Nursery in Guilderland. And so I'd never been there before. I found the place, went in, asked for the manager, and she said, yeah, she'll be right out. And now comes this smiling young girl. I mean, her smile alone took care of my stomach, It was just wonderful meeting her. And I started to introduce myself and say, Amy, I'm Matt, and I have a worm casting business. And all of a sudden, out of her mouth, she said, you're Captain Matt! And she said, I've been watching your worm videos. And I'm like, whoo, this is good. And Amy was so excited about the product that she bought the largest order I would ever suggest to one of our nurseries at one time. And she ordered the whole thing, and she gave me this big, big hug. And and sent me on my way. And I was like, woo, I'm in business now. I'm a worm casting business, you know. And that day I went to, I made contact with 9 different stores, and out of the 9 different stores, every one of them took my product. Every one of them. Now, it gets complicated, but you have to listen because I'm trying to teach you a little bit about, you know, local business and how to do it. One of the things is 2 of the businesses looked at me and said, yeah, we'd like to have some, but we don't want to pay you ahead of time. We'll pay you after we sell them, and then we'll split that. And I was like, no, I sell these. You buy them, and then you sell them, and I walk away, and I have money. And they say, oh, no. So I got to do something, so I made the decision to give them in consignment to 2 stores. And let me just give you a piece of advice. Even if it's local business, don't go consignment. When I went, in the fall, when I went back to all my nurseries to see how they did, it was wonderful. They're all gone in a few of the stores. Some had some on the shelf still, but the sales were really, really good. And but the 2 stores that we did consignment with, one, I got in the store, I said, oh man, you sold them all. And he said, no, we didn't sell any. I said, why aren't they on the shelf? He said, we put them in the garbage can in the back. And, well, that's all right. It's okay. I may never talk to the guy again, but it's okay. But, and the thing is, no pain, no gain. If you're selling, they got to pay the price. You know, and Laura hit on that. You know, they've got to pay the price ahead of time. Some of them haven't sold everything. Thanks to you and the other people involved in the vermiculture culture, and because of what you're doing and what you're writing and what you're sharing with your friends and how you're sharing it, you know, today worm castings has become a household word for people that have backyard gardens. And that wasn't the case 4 years ago. It's changing drastically. Today, because of you and what you're doing and what everyone else in the industry is doing, today, when I walk into a nursery, a new nursery, I don't have to explain worm castings. They already know all about worm castings. I have to clear some things up, but they already know about it. And that's the wonderful thing. That's the momentum that is going on in this industry. It's really something wild. But when you go in and a manager looks at you and says, oh yeah, we know about worm casting, I say, well, tell me what you know. And one guy brought me over to a bag. He said, see the bag over there against the wall? And I saw this big bag, 40 foot. You got to stay next to the mic. All right. I didn't even look over there, but I felt Heath looking at it. So he's got this big 40-foot bag over in the corner, and it says over the bag, worm castings. And my stomach tore up again. I was like, holy smokes. My market is crumbling in front of me. So I went over to the bag, and you've got to do this. I went over to the bag to see what was in the bag, because they'll tell you what's in the bag. And it wasn't worm castings. It was a blend of soils, they call it, and it had some worm castings in it. And so you have to know that as you're going out to speak to nurseries and to food co-ops or wherever you're going to sell your goods. You've got to explain to them, these are worm castings. This is the poo of the worm, and what's over there is not the poo of the worm. It's a bunch of dirt with a few sprinkles of poo. This is the stuff everybody's looking for. So you've got to educate, even though they say they know about them, you've got to educate them still about them. What else you have to do when you're selling locally is you have to speak to the manager of the store and talk to them about where you're going to get to put your product. Amy, a sweetheart of a woman, did a wonderful job the first year, did a great job the second year. Last year we changed our boxing and our labeling, and it ended up in the back of the store in a corner on a shelf, and so all the other fertilizers and the organic fertilizer, the worm castings, were in the corner, and she barely sold anything. You've got to speak to the store manager and let the store manager talk to him, say, it's a new product. This is something people are going to buy. but you got to put it in their face so that they see that we have it and you can't hide it. Another one of my stores, I went to check and see how they did. And again, there was a lot of product left on the rack. And I looked at the guy and I said, well, I guess you're probably not going to want to make an order for next year, are you? And he said, nope, I'm not going to want to give you another order next year. And so I left it at that and I walked away and I thought to myself, I'm building a business, you know, and although we have a lot of stores, I'm building a business, and I have limited number of stores, and I can't afford to lose them because we had a bad time. So here's what I did. It's not a big deal for me to box up a few boxes of castings, or even a dozen boxes. But I went back and saw him and I said, listen, Fred, I do not want to lose you as a customer. Now, he was looking at me saying, you weren't a very good customer anyway. You know, but I didn't want to lose him, and I wanted him to know that. And I said, I'll take everything you have in the store, and I'm going to restock your store at my cost this year. Now, I want to tell you something. That, we're a small business, you know, that was like, whoa, we took a hit. But I had 10 more years maybe. All right, 5. So I got 5 more years. My grandkids have some years after that. We're building a business, and you're building a business. And when you run into situations like that, sometimes just take it on yourself, all right? Because that man will never forget. Next time he sees me approach him in his store, he's going to say, here comes the guy that just really did me good, you know? And we're going to do well, and I'm going to help him, and we're going to put the product in the right place so that it sells well. I would never have believed if you told me 10 years ago that I'd be here, but here we are. And another area that I use for marketing is farmers markets. We happen to be in Troy, New York. It's a very ritzy town. New Yorkers, you know, Brooklyn money from New York City have taken over our area. And because we have so many people at our market, we really do well. But you may say, gee, our market isn't that big. Well, I got to know a lot of the vendors at the market. And a lot of the vendors travel 1 hour and a half to get to that market. And that really, that got me. I was like, now I understand why, because I got the cha-ching after, you know, a few weeks at the market. I was like, this is really good. And that's why these guys traveled an hour and a half. So if you're going to do a market, don't be satisfied with the fact that your market's on a Wednesday and there are 5 vendors and you don't know why your castings aren't selling. You go find the biggest market around. If you have to travel once a week to build your business, it may not be forever, but travel. Get the stuff out there. Sell the stuff. There's nothing more rewarding than at the end of the day to sit down and count the money that you just brought in. And it's not the money, it's that I labored really hard. And here's what I got for it. And it stinks if you go to a market where you sold 2 boxes of worm castings and you're still in debt for $10,000. You know? You have to make sure you get the right market. This year is going to be number 4 for us. And I'm having more fun in the worm casting business than I ever imagined. At my market, the level of excitement about worm castings and gardens, with everyone starting to think about using raised beds, and we have no-till gardening going on in most of the raised beds in our area. And people are excited about gardening, and sales are really great. And so when it comes to going to the market on Saturday, I don't go with a lump in my stomach. I go really excited. I also, when I go to the market, I have a captain's chair. I have a guy in the market next to me. He sharpens knives. And he does a good job. He sharpened mine. He did a good job. Overcharged me, but that's not that good. So he's over here, and he has his booth set up. His wife is in the corner knitting, looking out away from the people. And he's sitting in a chair, and he's so slouched down in his chair, and he's reading a book. I want to tell you something. I looked at him and said, boy, if that's the way I look, I don't want to do a farmer's market anymore. So I went and I got a captain's chair. Man, I sit up really high on that captain's chair, and I'm right up to the table where the people are coming to. And I don't even get out of the chair. It's not laziness. We're right there. We're face to face. We're talking with each other. And, you know, I get out of the chair if I have to, if something has to be done. But if you're going to sell, make sure that you are appearing like you're interested. Make sure that you do your setup really well. Get yourself, you say, yeah, we've had that 10 by 10 out in the back of the garage for another 30 years, it's been back there. Maybe we can use that. No, maybe you can't use that if you want to make sales. Get yourself a fresh pop-up. Get yourself a nice table. Get a nice tablecloth. Online, we offer to the community all your labeling, all your banners. Some of you are using it. Our banners, our lower banner in the back, which is an explanation of worm castings. When people come, even if they're not farmers, they just want to come over and read our banners and read what we're doing and talk to us. And I hear from people over and over again, that is some really sharp looking packaging you have there. And that's what you need. We're farmers, we're worm farmers, we're messing with pool a week, but on the weekend we're salespeople, and we want to make the best impression that we possibly can. So, a few other things fast. This year we went to the Flower and Garden Show. I heard about it, so I called. And they said, yep, your booth, you can get a 10 by 10 booth for $800. I said, $800 what? And they said, $800. I said, well, how big is my booth? They said, you got a 10 by 10. And then she told me, yeah, but you'll have 7,000 to 13,000 people, depending on the weather, coming right by your booth. I remember looking at Luke the first time. Luke and his mom do finances. I'm a little reckless with money, Samantha. And they keep me under control. And the first thing Luke said, I said, it's $800. Luke said, nope, we don't got that kind of money, Dad. Nope, we're not doing it. So I let a little time go and went back and we talked about it. And so we went. Yeah, we paid $800. We sold $2,400 worth of goods in those 3 days. And on top of that, my name got out everywhere. My business card was everywhere. When it comes to a local business, the opportunities are endless. But here's the deal. If you don't walk through the door, you're not going to find the next door. When I opened the door to decide, okay, I took a lot of Pepto-Bismol and we got our tummy in good shape, and I decided to walk through that door. I could have said no at that point. I could have said, all right, we'll take our losses. I'll do it for the garden. But I walked through the door, as difficult as it was, and guess what happened? There was another door behind that door. And I would never have seen that other door if I hadn't walked through the first door. And I keep walking through doors. Keep going. Walk through the door. Don't be shy. If you get to know Samantha, probably one of the toughest women in America. And when you see her facility this afternoon, you're going to go, whoa! But the reality is this. There's sweat drops all over the place. There's teardrops all over the place. She's been beat up. She's been beat down. But she just keeps going forward. And she keeps going forward. And she keeps going forward. She's going to be the biggest producer of worms in the United States. I said that to her a year ago. You are just going to be the biggest. Because she walked through the door. She kept going through the door. She opens every door that comes her way. And wonderful things. Here we are. There would be no conference if Mimi didn't decide to take that 50 worms on her back porch and see if she couldn't work and make that 2 bins of worms instead of 1 bin of worms. Knock them dead, worm people. Knock them dead.